The lanterns of Venice trembled on the water, their reflections shattered into ribbons of gold across the dark canals. The city at night was both silence and music, the lapping of water against stone, the faint strains of a lute from a distant palazzo, the murmur of masked figures gliding along narrow streets. Venice lived by night as much as by day, for under the cover of shadows the Republic revealed its other face, the one unbound by law, the one ruled by desire. It was the 16th century, and Venice was at its height, a maritime empire gilded by trade, perfumed by spice, fattened by the riches of the East. Palaces rose from the water like marble dreams, churches shone with gold mosaics, and merchants boasted fortunes that rivaled princes. Yet beneath the grandeur there was another Venice, one veiled and masked, where the line between holiness and sin blurred until neither could be told apart. Carnival never truly ended here. Even outside its festival season, the city was a perpetual masquerade. The masks that Venetians wore were not only for revels but for daily transgressions, disguises that permitted them to gamble, to visit courtesans, to slip into intrigues without fear of recognition. Respectable senators could kneel in church by morning and lose fortunes in brothels by night. Piety and pleasure, confession and indulgence, law and vice all coexisted on the same stage. Venice was both holy and damned, and its people seemed content to be both. And at the centre of this city of masks stood the courtesan, not a prostitute in the common sense, but something far more dangerous. The Venetian courtesan was scholar, wit, and seductress. She conversed with poets and senators, quoted Petrarch as easily as she revealed her flesh, wore pearls, not merely as adornment, but as symbols of conquest. To be admitted to her bed was costly. To be admitted to her company was to gain entry to a hidden world of salons and intrigue. Men feared her as much as they, adored her, for she wielded weapons beyond beauty, wit, learning, and the power to ruin reputations with a single whispered word. It was in this world that one woman rose higher than all others, her name whispered with awe, lust, and scandal. Veronica Franco. She was no ordinary courtesan. Her beauty alone would have secured her patrons, but it was her pen that set her apart. In a city where women's voices were meant to be silent, she published poems. In an age where men wielded words as weapons, she fought back with satire, with wit sharp enough to draw blood. She lived as muse and mistress, as poet and courtesan, adored in her prime and condemned in her fall. Beneath the mask, she was a daughter, a lover, a survivor. But Venice never cared for the woman beneath. To Venice, Veronica was always performance exalted when she adorned their pleasures, despised when she reminded them of their hypocrisy. The lanterns of the city flickered as gondolas glided beneath bridges, carrying masked revellers to their pleasures. Behind shuttered windows, voices whispered her name. Some spoke it with lust, some with envy, some with venom. For Veronica Franco was not simply a woman. She was a scandal dressed in silk, a poem written in flesh, a mask that revealed more than it concealed. And her story, like Venice itself, would be one of beauty and ruin, of desire and betrayal, of survival in a world forever cloaked in masks. The curtain rises, the canals glisten, and the courtesan poet steps onto history's stage. The city breathed secrets. Every stone bridge was a witness, every darkened call a confessional. Masks hung not only upon faces but upon souls, for in Venice the very air was disguise. A senator might pass you cloaked in anonymity, his crimson robes exchanged for plain black silk, his eyes hidden behind a white bauta. A noblewoman, pious in her family pew, might slip into a gondola at dusk and vanish into a brothel's lantern glow, and no one dared to pull away the mask, for in this city, exposure was death, but secrecy was freedom. The Republic itself was called La Serenissima, the most serene, but serenity was only surface. Beneath the glittering facades, passions churned like the waters of the lagoon. Money poured in from the east, silks from China, spices from India, gold from Africa. With wealth came indulgence. With indulgence came corruption. Priests preached chastity from pulpits, then sought absolution for their own nightly wanderings. Doges paraded with holy relics, then slipped into masked balls where even the holy could not be distinguished from the damned. This duplicity created the perfect soil for the courtesan to thrive. She was the embodiment of Venice's contradictions, adored and despised, honoured and condemned. Men wrote sonnets to her beauty while magistrates drafted laws against her profession. Artists immortalised her in paint while confessors whispered of her sins. She was muse and harlot, goddess and temptation. And yet, in her salons, where laughter rose like smoke and wine flowed like blood, the real Venice revealed itself. A city not of saints, but of masks. And into this theatre of shadows would step Veronica Franco, a woman destined not only to play the role but to master it, to turn her mask into both armour and weapon. Where others offered only their flesh, she would wield her mind. Where others were silenced by shame, she would answer with poetry. Her story was Venice's story, glittering and rotting, exalted and damned, a city of desire poised always at the brink of ruin. For in Venice, masks do not merely hide, they whisper, they promise. And when they are finally removed, what lies beneath is never innocence, but truth too terrible to face in daylight. And so the lanterns burn, the canals shimmer, and the stage is set. A courtesan's laughter drifts across the water, mingling with the sigh of the tide. The city of masks awaits its poet. The city rose from the sea. Like a vision, its domes and bell towers shimmering above the lagoon, its palaces floating on foundations of waterlogged stone. To those who approached from the Adriatic, Venice was a miracle, a republic built upon shifting tides, a city that seemed to defy nature itself. The year was the 16th century, and Venice was not merely a city but an empire. Its ships sailed as far as Alexandria and Constantinople. Its merchants dealt in spices and silks. Its gold weighed heavily in the markets of Europe. La Serenissima, the most serene republic, appeared eternal, untouchable, inviolate. Yet beneath this serenity, Venice was a furnace of desires. Wealth had brought splendour, but also decadence. The Rialto bustled by day, with merchants haggling, gondoliers shouting, coins clinking in crowded hands. But by night, another Rialto awoke. Gaming houses glowing with lantern light, dice rattling, cards slapped against tables, fortunes won and lost in a heartbeat. Wine spilled, laughter rang, and masked figures slipped into shadowy chambers where pleasures of every kind were bought and sold. Carnival was the truest expression of the city's soul. Officially confined to a season before Lent, in truth, it bled across the calendar until the entire year felt like one long masked revel. The bauta, that stark white mask with its long chin and blank expression, allowed a senator to gamble beside a beggar, a priest to dance beside a courtesan, a noblewoman to meet her lover unseen. The mask was not disguise, it was liberation, a license for transgression. In Venice, a city ruled by appearances, the mask was the most honest face of all. This atmosphere created the paradox for which Venice became infamous. It was at once pious and profane. The city boasted more churches than most kingdoms, their domes blazing with mosaics, their altars heavy with gold. Processions filled the streets with relics and hymns, incense thick as fog. Yet those same streets, only hours later, hosted masquerades where naked flesh gleamed beneath candlelight and laughter mocked the very saints whose statues towered above. Venetian morality was a mask itself, rigid in public, shameless in private. Within this paradox, the courtesan found her kingdom. Ordinary prostitutes lined the bridges and alleys, their services cheap and their lives expendable. But the cortigiane oneste, the honest courtesans, were another class entirely. They were educated, refined, skilled not only in pleasure but in wit, music and poetry. They dined with senators, debated with scholars, inspired painters, and composed letters that circulated like works of art. Their salons rivaled those of noble families. Their jewels rivaled those of patrician brides. They lived precariously, yes, but also gloriously, perched between reverence and damnation. Venetian men could not resist them. To take a courtesan as one's mistress was not only indulgence but status. It marked a man as cultured, refined, capable of appreciating both beauty and intellect. Yet those same men, after leaving her bed, might rise in the Senate to pass laws restricting her movements, condemning her trade, and branding her as sinner. Venice needed its courtesans for desire, was the lifeblood of the city, but it despised them too, for they exposed the hypocrisy of its morality. The city itself was complicit. Paintings of courtesans adorned palaces under the guise of Venetian beauties. Poets immortalized them, in verse while denying them respectability. Foreign travellers wrote in awe of them, half shocked, half entranced. Venice was famed not only for its canals and gondolas, but for its women, as essential to the city's myth as its doge and its domes. And yet the courtesan's life was always precarious. A single scandal could destroy her. A lover's betrayal, a rival's whisper, an accusation of witchcraft, all could send her tumbling from luxury into poverty. She was adored at 20, mocked at 40, and forgotten soon after. Beauty was her coin, wit her weapon, but both could be stripped from her by age, by envy, by fate. This was the Venice into which Veronica Franco was born. A city at once magnificent and corrupt, holy and profane, eternal and doomed. A city of masks, where desire ruled and hypocrisy reigned. A city that would make her its muse, its scandal, its cautionary tale. For in Venice, every glittering mask concealed a crack, and beneath the shimmer of lanterns on the canals, shadows always waited. Venice at twilight was a city painted in contradictions. The last light of day spilled across the lagoon in shades of crimson and gold, the marble facades of palaces glowing like embers, while shadows pooled in narrow canals where gondolas drifted silently, their oars dipping like black wings. Church bells tolled the Ave Maria, summoning the faithful to prayer. Yet even as the sound echoed across the water, shutters opened to reveal hidden salons, laughter rising like incense, dice clattering on wooden tables, music spilling from lutes and viols. The Republic prided itself on order, its Senate, its Doge, its councils of patricians who governed with the precision of a clock. Outsiders marvelled at its stability, calling it the envy of Europe. Yet for all its order, Venice throbbed with lawlessness. Smugglers slipped contraband into the city's veins, bribes greased the hands of officials, masked assassins dispatched rivals in the fog. It was said that in Venice, every pleasure could be purchased, and every crime forgiven so long as one knew the right mask to wear. The mask was Venice's greatest invention, more powerful than any weapon forged in its shipyards. The bauta, with its stark blankness, erased identity. The moretta, an oval of velvet held between the teeth, silenced the wearer even as it concealed her face. Masks democratized desire. Beneath them, noblemen consorted with courtesans, priests gambled with thieves, widows danced with strangers whose names they never learned. The mask promised both anonymity and intimacy, a paradox as intoxicating as the city itself. Carnival brought this paradox to its height. For weeks, the streets became a stage where rules dissolved. Jugglers and acrobats dazzled crowds, fireworks lit the sky, masked processions flooded the piazzas. Men dressed as women, peasants as princes, devout monks as devils. Vice was not hidden but celebrated, indulgence sanctified in spectacle. In Venice, foreign travellers wrote, all is permitted save only the sin of being dull. It was during Carnival that courtesans shone brightest, for their beauty, wit, and extravagance were as essential to the revels as fireworks above the lagoon. The courtesan was not merely tolerated, she was woven into the fabric of Venetian life. She represented both its triumph and its decay. Her salons were centres of culture, where philosophers debated, poets recited, musicians performed. Yet she was also condemned from pulpits, her very existence proof of Venice's corruption. The paradox was embodied in law. Courtesans were forbidden from wearing pearls, yet they flaunted them openly, their jewels rivaling those of patrician wives. Magistrates railed against their influence, yet senators visited them nightly. For men, the courtesan offered more than sex. She was companion, confidant, muse. In her presence, a merchant might forget the burden of trade, a senator might escape the weight of governance. She flattered egos, sharpened wits, soothed ambitions. She was in many ways the true soul of Venice, its beauty, its decadence, its mask of refinement hiding the raw hunger beneath. But her position was never secure. A courtesan's power depended on youth, beauty, and favour. One patron might elevate her with jewels and estates, another might discard her at the first whisper of scandal. Rivalries between courtesans were fierce, for each knew that her survival depended upon eclipsing the pie. Others. A single insult could ignite feuds carried out in verse, in gossip, even in accusations of witchcraft. And when her beauty faded, when patrons withdrew, when fortune turned, she could sink swiftly into poverty, condemned by the very society that once exalted her. This hypocrisy was Venice itself. The city's grandeur was built on trade with the East, yet it condemned foreign luxuries as temptations. Its senators spoke of virtue, while their mistresses wore diamonds bought with bribes. Its churches glittered with gold, even as its priests indulged in carnival. Venice was both holy and profane, eternal and corrupt. And the courtesan adored, despised, exalted, destroyed was its truest mirror. It was into this shimmering labyrinth of contradictions that Veronica Franco was born. She would grow to embody all of Venice's paradoxes: beauty and wit, sin and sanctity, triumph and ruin. She would walk masked through its canals, laugh in its salons, write poems that cut like knives. And like her city, she would dazzle and betray, survive and fall, leaving behind a legend both celebrated and cursed. For Venice was not only a city, it was a stage, and its courtesans, glittering and doomed, were the stars of its eternal masquerade. Venice, for all its laws and councils, for all its senators robed in crimson, and its doges enthroned beneath mosaics of saints, was a city built as much upon pleasure as upon piety. And in this city of masks, there emerged a class of women who lived at the intersection of desire and intellect, scandal and admiration: the courtesans. They were not merely prostitutes. To confuse the two was to misunderstand entirely the delicate architecture of Venetian vice. The common prostitute plied her trade on bridges and in alleys, her face lined by hunger, her body sold for a coin or two, her existence tolerated but despised. She wore plain cloth, her hair uncovered, and the magistrates recorded her name in registers meant to contain and shame. She was necessary. Yes, for Venice's men were restless, and the city had long understood that appetite must have outlets, but she was never celebrated. She belonged to the gutter. The courtesan was different. She was cortigiana honesta, the honoured courtesan. The phrase itself was paradox, for how could a woman who sold her body be honoured? And yet, in Venice, contradiction was survival. The courtesan was honoured not for chastity, but for refinement. She was educated, witty, adorned in silks and jewels. She quoted Petrarch, debated Plato, played the lute, sang with a voice that lured senators to tears. She entertained not in shadowed alleys, but in candlelit salons, where poets and noblemen gathered at her invitation. She was mistress, yes, but also muse, sometimes even patron. Her power lay in her ability to transform vice into art. Men who sought her bed were compelled also to respect her mind. In a world where patrician wives were cloistered, silent, and obedient, the courtesan spoke freely, laughed boldly, sparred with wit. She became the only kind of woman who could meet men as equals or better, as their superiors. The rise of the courtesans was no accident. Venice, with its masked anonymity and its carnival of contradictions, cultivated them. The Republic was rich, its men indulgent, its society hungry for novelty. Marriage among patricians was a matter of contract, arranged to preserve bloodlines and fortunes. Love and desire found no place in such unions, and so men sought fulfillment elsewhere. The courtesans filled that void, offering not only pleasure but conversation, companionship, and flattery. They were confidantes as much as lovers, safe havens for secrets that could not be spoken in council chambers. Some became legendary. Veronica Franco would one day be among them, but before her there were others who carved the path. Names that drift through history like perfumes. Tullia d'Aragona, poetess and philosopher, who wrote of love as, though dissecting it with a scalpel. Gaspara Stampa, whose verses still burn with the anguish of passion betrayed. These women were not silent, not submissive. They were voices in a world that sought to still women's tongues, and they made themselves indispensable by wrapping intellect in allure. Yet for all their elevation, courtesans lived precariously. Their fame was fragile, dependent on beauty, wit, and the fickle favour of patrons. A rival courtesan might spread slander, a jealous wife might whisper poison into her husband's ear, a priest might thunder of sin until magistrates grew restless. At any moment, the courtesan's salon could collapse, her jewels pawned, her silks replaced by rags. The Republic, which exalted her in one breath, might destroy her in the next. And yet, for all the danger, the courtesan was irresistible. Venice celebrated her even as it condemned her. Foreign travellers sought her out as eagerly as they admired the mosaics of San Marco. Painters immortalized her, veiling her identity under the title of Venetian beauty, though everyone knew the truth. Musicians composed for her, poets inscribed her name into sonnets, nobles risked fortunes for her favour. In the candlelit salons where they reigned, courtesans were queens of another Venice. The Venice not of law but of desire, not of piety but of indulgence. Here masks were not discarded but embraced, and behind them truths emerged that the daylight Senate dared not admit. This was the stage upon which Veronica Franco would soon step. Born into the contradiction, raised by a mother who understood both its perils and its promise, she would rise not only as a courtesan, but as its poetess, a woman who turned her survival into verse, her scandal into immortality. The courtesans of Venice had made desire into an empire. Franco would make it into a weapon. The courtesans' salons were unlike any other space in Venice. Patrician houses glittered with wealth, but their women sat silent, obedient, their beauty displayed like porcelain, their voices hushed. In the courtesans' chambers, by contrast, the air was alive with music, poetry, and debate. There, men unmasked themselves, not literally, for masks still covered faces during revels, but in spirit. Senators who thundered in the halls of the Republic spoke of longing like schoolboys. Poets who competed for laurels in the piazzas whispered their verses to women whose laughter decided their worth. A courtesan's salon was half stage, half confessional, and entirely intoxicating. Their power lay not only in beauty but in performance. Courtesans dressed themselves like living artworks. They draped pearls across their necks, wore gowns embroidered with gold thread, scented their hair with oils brought from the Levant. Each appearance was calculated, a battle fought with silk and perfume, with the flash of a jewel at the throat, the subtle reveal of a shoulder. For men accustomed to demure wives hidden behind veils, the courtesan's audacity was shocking, irresistible. Yet their greatest adornment was conversation. The cortigiana onesta had to be educated, her wit as polished as her skin. She quoted Virgil, debated Aristotle, recited Petrarch from memory. Some spoke multiple languages, others played instruments, sang with voices trained to seduce not only the ear but the soul. A courtesan who lacked wit could not rise, no matter her beauty. For beauty was abundant in Venice, but intellect sharpened desire into obsession. Men of every rank succumbed. Merchants, swollen with wealth from the spice trade, lavished fortunes upon them. Senators and ambassadors vied for their company, their reputations burnished by association with a courtesan celebrated for her wit. Even kings and princes, visiting Venice in disguise, sought out these women whose fame echoed across Europe. To have been with such a courtesan was a badge of distinction, a story to be whispered later in hushed tones. But adoration was dangerous. With each admirer came jealousy, and jealousy in Venice was a blade. Courtesans fought their rivals not only with beauty but with slander. They poisoned reputations with whispered accusations, sometimes with venomous verses that circulated like wildfire. A courtesan who rose too high might find herself accused of witchcraft, for what else but sorcery could explain a woman wielding such influence over senators and scholars? The Inquisition lurked in the shadows, eager to pounce upon women whose power challenged the order of things. The city itself fed the paradox. On one hand, it exalted courtesans as living emblems of its splendour. Artists painted them in silks, their faces luminous, their bodies idealized. Writers described them as muses, likening them to Venus herself. Foreign visitors returned home with tales of Venetian women who outshone queens in both beauty and wit. On the other hand, the Republic passed laws to restrain them, forbidding them from certain jewels or from attending certain ceremonies. Yet these laws were mocked, ignored, flaunted. Courtesans walked through the Piazza San Marco glittering with pearls they were forbidden to wear, their very defiance part of their allure. Still, the shadow of ruin loomed over them all. Beauty faded. Patrons aged, withdrew, or died. The same society that had exalted them could discard them in an instant. Many courtesans ended their lives in poverty, their jewels pawned, their silks threadbare, their salons silent. Some vanished into convents, veiling the faces once painted by artists. Others sank into the gutters they had once escaped, indistinguishable from the common prostitutes they had surpassed. But a rare few transcended even this precariousness. They inscribed their names into history, not through their bodies but through their words. Gaspara Stampa left behind poems that still tremble with passion centuries later. Tulia d'Aragona debated philosophy with men who begrudgingly admitted her brilliance. And Veronica Franco, who would soon rise from obscurity, would not only write poetry but publish it, daring to speak in her own voice in a world that demanded silence from women. She would be courtesan and poet, muse and creator, lover and critic. The courtesans of Venice had created a strange and perilous empire, built upon beauty, wit and masks. They ruled not by decree, but by desire. Their palaces were salons, their crowns were pearls, their swords were verses whispered into the night, but their kingdom was fragile, forever at risk of collapse. They were adored, yet despised, celebrated, yet condemned, and it was upon this glittering, treacherous stage that Veronica Franco would step to claim her place, to wield her pen, and to carve her name into history's memory. For if Venice was a city of masks, then the courtesan was its truest face. She was born in 1546, in a city where birth could seal a destiny before a child ever drew her first breath. Veronica Franco entered the world not in a palace of patricians, but in the modest household of artisans, a family respectable enough to claim dignity, but far removed from the crimson-robed senators whose power ruled the Republic. Her father was a man of trade, her mother a woman of sharper ambition, and it was her mother's influence that would shape her path more than any paternal hand. Her mother, Paola Fracassa, knew Venice's contradictions well. She herself had been a courtesan, and though age had stolen her beauty, it had not dulled her cunning. She had lived within the paradox of Venetian morality exalted by men in salons, condemned by priests in pulpits, surviving in the narrow space between glamour and disgrace. From her, Veronica inherited not only her beauty but also her education, for Paola understood that in Venice, a courtesan without wit was a courtesan destined for the gutter. Thus, Veronica's childhood was not cloistered, not silent, not pious in the way of patrician daughters. She was taught letters, taught music, taught the art of conversation. While noble girls embroidered in silence, Veronica read poetry. While brides to be rehearsed obedience, Veronica rehearsed wit. Paola prepared her not for marriage but for the salons where wit and beauty could wield more power than any dowry. Yet such preparation carried tension. Veronica was not blind to the peril. From her earliest years, she would have seen courtesans parading in silks by day and slinking into shadows by night, their reputations both jewels and chains. She would have heard sermons thundering against them, branding them sinners, witches, temptresses. She would have seen them adored at 20 and abandoned at 40. And yet she would also have seen their salons filled with scholars, their names whispered with awe, their beauty celebrated in paintings and poems. To a girl of sharp mind and sharper ambition, the courtesan's path was not merely sin, it was possibility. Her adolescence passed in the shadow of this paradox. Veronica's beauty began to reveal itself early. Luminous eyes, dark hair, a grace of movement that caught notice even in the crowded streets of Venice. Suitors whispered, neighbours watched, and her mother guided her steps with a firm hand. "You will not be wasted," Paola is said to have told her, "sewn into a dowry cloth for some dull husband who will silence your tongue. You will rise higher than that." But Venice was not merciful, and Veronica's path was not entirely her own. At a young age she was married, as many women were, to a man chosen more for convenience than love, Paolo Panizza, a physician. The union was brief and bitter. Panizza proved cruel, and Veronica, though young, was neither meek nor willing to be crushed. The marriage collapsed, and she left him, an act scandalous enough to mark her forever. In a society where divorce was nearly impossible, separation branded her as damaged, precarious, vulnerable, and so the choice became necessity. With her marriage in ruin and her reputation already fractured, Veronica turned to the path her mother had long prepared her for. She became a courtesan. But not just any courtesan, she entered the profession as an onesta, the honoured class, the kind who dined with senators and debated with poets. Her wit and beauty carried her upward swiftly, drawing patrons of rank, men who sought not only her body but her conversation, her laughter, her companionship. This transformation was both empowerment and imprisonment. Veronica Franco was no longer merely Paola's daughter, nor Paolo Panizza's discarded wife. She was courtesan mistress to Venice's elite, a woman who could command attention in salons where noble women remained silent. Yet she also stepped into the shadow where every courtesan lived, the shadow of ruin, where admiration could turn to condemnation and favour could curdle into betrayal. Still, in these early years, she burned with promise. She was not content to be silent or ornamental. She wrote letters that cut with wit, poems that revealed both passion and intellect. She did not wait to be immortalized by men. She immortalized herself. Even in her beginnings, one could sense that Veronica Franco would not be merely another courtesan whose beauty faded into oblivion. She would carve her name into Venice's memory with her pen as much as with her body. The canals glistened, masks shifted, salons hummed with intrigue, and in the midst of it all, a young courtesan with dark eyes and a sharper mind stepped into her destiny. She was not yet legend, not yet scandal, not yet poetess of Venice, but the stage had been set, and Veronica Franco had taken her first step upon it. Venice in the mid-16th century was a city of thresholds, and Veronica Franco's earliest memories must have been of crossing them thresholds of palazzi that seemed like fortresses of marble, thresholds of churches, echoing with Latin, chants, thresholds of her own mother's chamber, where secrets of survival were whispered. Childhood in Venice was not innocence, it was apprenticeship. And for a girl like Veronica, it meant learning how to read a city that spoke in masks. Her mother, Paola, did not shield her from this world. Some mothers hid their daughters behind convent walls or prepared them for the cloistered silence of marriage. Paola chose differently. She saw in her daughter not only beauty but brilliance, and brilliance in women was dangerous unless armed with knowledge. So Paola taught Veronica to read letters, to memorize verses, to play the lute and sing madrigals that could charm the learned as well as the lustful. When noble daughters embroidered, Veronica practiced repartee. When patrician brides learned obedience, Veronica learned resistance. Yet there was another education, darker, given not through books, but through observation. Veronica saw her mother's acquaintances, women painted in jewels, their laughter bright but their eyes haunted. She saw patrons who arrived at night in gondolas heavy with velvet, men whose power could elevate or destroy with a whim. She overheard confessions whispered too loudly through walls, of favours bought, of rivals betrayed, of fortunes gained and squandered. For a child, such glimpses might have seemed like a play performed endlessly before her. But beneath the stagecraft, Veronica absorbed the truth that Venice was a city where women survived by playing roles, and those who forgot they were acting were devoured. Her youth might have offered another fate had her marriage endured. Paolo Panizza, the physician she wed while still very young, could have anchored her in respectability. But the union soured quickly. Accounts vary. Some whisper he was violent, others that he was simply cold, incapable of tolerating her sharp wit and proud bearing. Whatever the truth, the marriage became a prison. Veronica, still barely more than a girl, found herself trapped between the expectations of obedience and the reality of cruelty. She resisted, she defied, she left him. In Venice, such defiance was no small act. A woman who separated from her husband branded herself with scandal. Divorce was nearly impossible. Separation left her marked as unruly, her virtue questioned, her prospects diminished. Yet for Veronica, the collapse of her marriage was also liberation. She would not be silenced, not be hidden behind walls of duty and decorum. The path her mother had hinted at now stretched before her, dangerous but open, the path of the courtesan. Her initiation into this world was not gentle. To declare oneself a courtesan was to step into a fire where one's worth was constantly tested. Beauty opened doors, yes, but beauty was common in Venice, a city where sunlight on the lagoon seemed to shape women's faces into art. To rise above the multitude required more wit, presence, audacity. Veronica possessed all three. She entered salons where men of letters gathered, her dark eyes meeting theirs without a flicker of shyness. She recited lines of poetry, sometimes her own, sometimes Petrarch's, and listened as the learned debated her words. They expected demure silence. She gave them sharp replies. They laughed at her boldness, and then returned, unable to forget the courtesan who dared to challenge them. Her first patrons were not kings or senators but wealthy merchants, men enriched by the spice trade, hungry not only for flesh but for conversation that made them feel cultivated. They gifted her pearls, silks, rings heavy with stones from the Levant, Each gift was not merely ornament but currency proof of her ascendancy, protection against poverty, tools with which to stage her identity. She learned quickly how to balance affection with calculation, how to make a man believe himself adored while keeping her heart shielded. For a courtesan's heart could not be given. It had to be reserved as the last. Mask, the final protection against ruin. Yet even as she played the role, Veronica Franco wrote, in the quiet after her salons emptied, by candlelight dripping wax into pools of shadow, she penned letters sharp, witty, unsparing. She observed men's hypocrisies and recorded them. She dissected the dualities of Venice, its priests who visited courtesans in secret, its senators who condemned what they could not resist. Writing was her true rebellion, her way of ensuring that she was not merely acted upon but acting. In ink, she claimed her voice. The courtesan's ascent was exhilarating but perilous. With each admirer came envy from rivals, suspicion from wives, disdain from priests. Veronica must have felt the tension daily, the thrill of walking into salons where men awaited her words, the dread of knowing one whispered slander could undo her. She dressed not only in silks but in armour of performance. Every smile was calculated, every jest sharpened, every glance measured to hold power, yet not provoke too much wrath. It was a dance, intricate, dangerous, endless. But Veronica was not merely surviving, she was rising. She had crossed the threshold from daughter to wife, from wife to abandoned woman, from abandoned woman to courtesan, and not just any courtesan, but one whose beauty and intellect made her stand apart. In Venice, where masks concealed truth, Veronica Franco had discovered her own truth, that she could wield both her body and her mind as weapons, that she could carve her name into history, not through submission, but through defiance. And so the girl who once listened at her mother's door to the laughter of courtesans and their patrons now presided over her own salons. The masks of Venice shifted around her, and she, too, wore hers. Yet behind it glowed a determination that no mask could hide, the determination to live not as ornament, but as voice, not as silence, but as song. Her early life had been marked by thresholds. The next would be the threshold of fame. The salons of Venice were firelit chambers where reputations were forged and ruined in the span of a single night. Men came to display wit as much as wealth, to quote Petrarch, to recite Ariosto, to gamble, to whisper politics behind masks of poetry, and among these gatherings the courtesan reigned. She was not there as ornament alone, she was queen of the night, setting the rhythm of conversation, granting her favour like a monarch bestowing titles. To be in her circle was to be seen, to be marked as cultured. To be excluded was humiliation. When Veronica Franco first entered these circles, her arrival was whispered before it was witnessed. A courtesan's reputation spread like perfume, carried by merchants returning from a night of revelry, by poets eager to name-drop, by senators who swore they visited only for the conversation. Already men had heard of her sharp tongue, her wit that could cut more cleanly than a sword, her beauty that seemed woven of both innocence and danger. It was not beauty alone that set her apart. Venice overflowed with beauty from the noble daughters married off at 15, their cheeks painted like porcelain, to the common prostitutes whose painted faces beckoned from bridges. Veronica's weapon was her mind. In salons thick with smoke and candlelight, she listened as men sparred with words, then answered with replies that silenced the room. She mocked hypocrisy with a smile, praised with such subtlety that her compliments sounded like rebukes, rebuked with such grace that men left feeling flattered. Her reputation grew quickly. Senators sought her company not only in bed but at table, eager for her approval, addicted to her laughter. Writers dedicated verses to her, some out of devotion, some out of hope that her name in their lines might lend them immortality. Artists painted her, though discreetly, veiling her likeness under allegory, presenting her as a Venus or a Muse, knowing the risk of admitting openly that their model was a courtesan. Among her admirers were men of rank and learning. Historians mention Marco Venier, a patrician and man of letters, as one of her patrons. He was cousin to the powerful Venier family, and his favour elevated her into elite salons that other courtesans could only dream of entering. In these rooms, she did not sit at the margins, but at the centre, her words as eagerly awaited as any man's. She had become not simply mistress, but muse. Yet being muse carried its own peril. Men exalted her in verse, comparing her to goddesses, but behind their adoration lay danger. A courtesan who inspired too much envy became a target. Other women, both noble wives and rival courtesans, whispered slander. Priests thundered from pulpits, condemning her as proof of Venice's decadence. The Inquisition, watchful always, kept notes on those who strayed too far beyond propriety. Every poem written in her honour, every jewel bestowed upon her, every hand that lingered upon hers in a salon, was a spark that could ignite scandal. Veronica knew this, but she walked the line with audacity. She was mistress, yes, but never submissive. Unlike many courtesans who softened their wit to please patrons, she sharpened hers to keep them enthralled. Men left her presence feeling both flattered and chastened, as though they had sparred with an equal, and in truth, they had. In an age where wives were silenced, Veronica Franco spoke, and her speech was intoxicating. The poets of Venice immortalized her in verse, though not always kindly. To some, she was muse, embodiment of beauty and intellect. To others, she was temptation, a siren dragging men into ruin. She responded in kind, writing her own poetry that both embraced and mocked the roles men cast upon her. In her letters later collected into a book, she revealed herself as sharp-tongued, witty, and deeply aware of her precarious place in society. Her salons became legends. By candlelight, beneath ceilings painted with mythic scenes, men gathered to hear her speak. Musicians played softly in the corner, servants poured wine that glowed ruby in glass. Veronica, seated in silks, listened with a half-smile, then spoke her words the true performance of the night. She quoted poets, challenged arguments, teased men until their ears burned, and when she laughed, the room seemed to bend toward her, men eager for another taste of her wit. Yet even at her height, danger never left her. Venice exalted its courtesans, but it never forgave them. She was celebrated, but she was also watched. Every rival courtesan, every jealous wife, every priest who sought to prove his zeal, had reason to bring her down. Veronica thrived in this atmosphere, but she never forgot that one misstep could undo her entirely. Still, for a time, she burned brightly. She was mistress and muse, lover and poet, courtesan and creator. Men sought her not only for her beauty but for her mind, and in that rare union lay her triumph. She had transcended the role of courtesan to become a figure of culture, a voice in Venice's intellectual golden age. But even as she rose, shadows lengthened. For the higher she climbed, the more perilous the fall. And in Venice, a city of masks, no woman could keep her face hidden forever. The transformation from mistress to muse was not an event, but a process, a slow ascension. Each evening in the salon, another step upward. Each poem written about her, another stone laid in the stairway of her renown. It began with whispers, the new courtesan, the one with the sharp tongue, the one who quotes Latin. It became rumour. The senators dine at her table, the poets ask her blessing. And then, before long, it was certainty. Veronica Franco was no longer merely a courtesan. She was a presence, a force, an intellectual companion as dangerous as she was alluring. Her salons became sanctuaries for men who longed to escape the rigid formality of patrician life. In the Senate, they argued law and empire. In their palazzi, they played the part of stern patriarchs. But in Veronica's chambers, beneath the flicker of candles and the scent of imported incense, they shed those masks. They confessed their fears, their ambitions, their longings. She listened, not as a silent vessel, but as an equal. She teased them when their words grew pompous, soothed them when their pride faltered, and reminded them always that they were men of flesh, not marble statues. It was here that her true artistry lay, not only in poetry, not only in seduction, but in the weaving of power. She allowed men to believe themselves in control while guiding the rhythm of every conversation, ensuring that she was always at the centre. To some, she was the beloved, to others, the adversary. To all, she was unforgettable. Her patrons showered her with gifts, strings of pearls from the Levant, silks dyed in Tyrian purple, mirrors framed in gilded wood. But these gifts were more than adornments. They were symbols of her rank. A courtesan's worth was displayed on her body, her jewels an armour, her gowns a declaration. When Veronica entered a room, The shimmer of her pearls and the weight of her velvet spoke as loudly as her laughter. Men saw not only a woman, but an empire draped across her shoulders, the wealth of Venice distilled into living form. Yet these gifts came with chains. Each patron believed his jewel, his ring, his estate gave him a claim upon her. And here too Veronica revealed her cunning. She accepted gifts with gratitude but never allowed them to enslave her. If one patron grew jealous, she mocked him with words sweet enough to wound without leaving scars. If another demanded exclusivity, she reminded him gently, cruelly, that a courtesan belongs to no man. It was a balancing act as treacherous as walking the narrow bridges of Venice by night, one misstep away from ruin. The poets were both her allies and her tormentors. They celebrated her beauty, immortalized her in verse, compared her to Venus rising from the sea, but they also envied her power. Some wrote sonnets in her praise only to follow them with lampoons, mocking her as harlot, seductress, witch. Veronica did not remain silent. She answered with verses of her own, her words as sharp as steel, her wit cutting through the hypocrisy of men who praised women in art but despised them in life. These poetic jewels became spectacles, whispered across salons, copied into notebooks, spread from Venice to Padua and beyond. Through it all, Veronica Franco emerged not as victim but as combatant. She wielded language as others wielded swords. In her letters, later collected into her celebrated Lettere Familiari, a diversi, she mocked lovers for their faithlessness, advised women on survival, and exposed the double standards of her society. Few women of her time dared to publish. Fewer still dared to speak with such audacity. Each word she wrote was a challenge, each verse a rebellion, each letter a declaration that she would not be silent. But the higher she climbed, the more precarious her position became. A courtesan who remained merely mistress could be dismissed, forgotten. A courtesan who became muse threatened the very order of Venice. Men admired her, but they also feared her. Wives loathed her. Priests thundered against her from pulpits, calling her and her sisters demons in silk. And always, the Inquisition watched. For a woman who spoke too boldly, who lived too freely, who wielded influence over powerful men, the charge of witchcraft was never far away. For now, though, Veronica thrived. She sat at the centre of Venice's cultural golden age, her beauty and intellect weaving together the strands of power, desire, and art. She was mistress, muse, poetess, courtesan roles that should have contradicted one another, yet in her they fused into one. Men left her salons dazed, uncertain whether they had been conquered or blessed, whether they had touched a woman or glimpsed a goddess. And as she looked into her mirror, framed in gilded wood, Veronica Franco must have known that her reflection was no longer merely her own. It was the reflection of Venice itself, masked, glittering, glorious and doomed. Venice adored surfaces. Marble facades gleamed on palaces, gold mosaics dazzled in churches, masks concealed sins with elegance. In such a city, the courtesan was both symbol and embodiment, a living facade, painted and adorned, whose survival depended upon the art of performance. Seduction in Venice was not simply the commerce of flesh, it was a ritual, a ceremony, a spectacle, and Veronica Franco mastered it like no other. To seduce in Venice required more than beauty. Beauty was common, plentiful, a coin in a city that minted it endlessly. What set a courtesan apart was how she displayed it, how she transformed her body into a stage, her voice into music, her wit into a blade. Every gesture was calculated, every glance rehearsed, every word sharpened to flatter or wound. Veronica understood this instinctively. She knew that to survive, she must not only be desired but remembered. Her preparation for an evening was itself a kind of liturgy. The bath scented with imported oils, the careful painting of her face with powders from Florence and unguents from the Levant, the dressing in gowns heavy with brocade or light as whispers of silk. Each layer transformed her from woman into courtesan, from flesh into vision. Pearls gleamed against her neck, a deliberate defiance of laws that forbade courtesans from wearing them. Rings sparkled on her fingers, each one a story of a conquest or patron. When she entered a salon, she was not simply Veronica. She was an apparition, a vision conjured to haunt the imagination. Yet clothing alone could not hold attention. What made Veronica Franco formidable was her tongue, In a society where noble wives were expected to keep silent, she spoke. In salons, she sparred with senators, her wit making them blush and laugh in the same breath. She quoted classical texts, not as parroting ornament, but as genuine intellect. She knew her Virgil, her Ovid, her Petrarch, and she wove their verses into conversation with ease. When men sought to corner her with pedantry, she answered with satire. When poets addressed her with clumsy flattery, she replied with barbed irony. Her words left marks sharper than scratches of a lover's nails. The courtesan's chamber was also a theatre of seduction. By candlelight, the air heavy with incense, music played by hired musicians set the rhythm of intimacy. Veronica could strum the lute herself, her fingers coaxing melodies as intoxicating as wine. Her voice, trained in song, could soften even the most hardened merchant. In those moments, seduction was not mere flesh but atmosphere, the weaving of sound, scent, and sight into a tapestry where men forgot their power and surrendered. Letters were another weapon. Veronica's correspondence, later published in her Lettere Familiaria Diversi, reveal how seduction continued long after patrons left her chamber. She wrote with wit and irony, reminding men of her brilliance as much as her beauty. Her letters mocked their faithlessness, teased their egos, and demanded gifts with such elegance that refusal seemed impossible. In her hands, the written word became a lure, pulling patrons back with promises half-spoken and desires half-mocked. Her poetry, too, was an act of seduction, but one that transcended individuals. In her terze rhyme, she wrote of passion and betrayal, of the hypocrisies of men, of the struggles of women forced to barter themselves for survival. These poems revealed her vulnerability and her defiance, offering not only allure but critique. In writing, Veronica seduced not just lovers but posterity itself, ensuring her voice would echo long after her beauty faded. Seduction, however, it was never safe. For each admirer, there was a rival. Other courtesans envied her renown, spread rumours sought to outshine her. Wives whispered poison into their husbands' ears, urging them to abandon the courtesan who mocked their sanctity. Priests thundered that she was a devil in silk, sent to tempt men into ruin. The Inquisition lurked, eager to brand outspoken women as witches. Seduction was a game played upon a blade's edge, where one misstep could mean poverty, disgrace, even death. Veronica walked this edge with fearless grace. She dared to wear pearls in defiance of law, dared to publish poetry in defiance of silence, dared to mock men in defiance of patriarchy. Each act of seduction was also an act of rebellion, a reminder that she was not property, not ornament, but force. Men adored her, but they also feared her. For she revealed in her laughter, her letters, her poetry, the truth Venice tried to mask, that beneath its grandeur, its piety, its laws, it was ruled by desire. To seduce in Venice was to wield power. To seduce, as Veronica Franco did, was to wield fire. And fire, though it dazzles, always threatens to consume. Seduction, for Veronica, was not a single act, but a choreography. The salons she presided over were carefully curated arenas where every element heightened her presence. The chamber itself was chosen with care, a room whose windows overlooked the canals, so that lantern light shimmered on the ceiling, casting moving reflections like restless spirits. Walls were hung with tapestries that softened sound and enclosed the space in intimacy. Tables bore goblets of Venetian glass, delicate and fragile, filled with wine imported from Cyprus. Every detail told her guests that they had entered not a common bedchamber, but a sanctuary where art, wit, and desire met. Here, Veronica practiced her most dangerous craft, the duel of conversation. Seduction was not confined to the body. In her salons, men longed to be challenged, to have their wit tested against hers. She would allow a senator to declaim a verse of Petrarch, nod with feigned admiration, then counter with a line of her own more apt, more clever, more biting. The room would erupt with laughter, and the senator, though stung, would leave more entranced than ever. She knew that men desired not only conquest but the illusion of battle, and she gave them both. Her poetry sharpened this power. The terze rhyme, that would one day immortalize, her circulated first among patrons, passed in manuscripts, whispered about in salons. These were not verses of demure submission. They mocked infidelity, laid bare the hypocrisies of men, and revealed a woman who felt, desired, and judged with equal force. One poem chided a lover for abandoning her, only to remind him that her worth outshone his fickleness. Another turned the tables on male poets, defending women's dignity against centuries of scorn. Through her poetry, she seduced not only with charm but with intellect, binding admirers to her with words as tightly as with embraces. Yet such audacity bred enemies. Rival courtesans resented her prominence. Some whispered that her beauty was fading, that her poetry was written by men, that her wit was merely memorized lines. Others sought to outshine her with more daring displays of flesh, more extravagant jewels. The rivalry among courtesans was brutal, for each knew her survival depended on eclipsing the rest. Veronica, however, possessed a weapon her rivals lacked: her pen. When slander spread, she answered with satire so sharp it left scars no jewel could conceal. Still, the danger was constant. Priests thundered her name from pulpits, declaring her poems the work of the devil, her salons dens of sin. The laws of Venice circled tighter, forbidding courtesans from pearls, from certain colours, from appearing too close to patrician wives. Each law was aimed at erasing their presence, yet Veronica flaunted them all. To appear in pearls, to ride in gondolas. Beside senators, to publish her verses, these were acts of defiance as much as seduction. She knew she was watched, perhaps even marked, but to retreat would be death of another kind, the death of obscurity. What made Veronica most dangerous was not her beauty, though it captivated, but her refusal to be silenced. In her salons, she laughed at men's hypocrisies. In her letters, she counselled women to resist submission. In her poetry, she dared to claim a voice in a world that demanded female silence. Each act of seduction became also an act of survival, and each act of survival became a step toward legend. But legend is a treacherous crown. To be remembered was to be envied, and to be envied was to be hunted. Veronica Franco danced upon this edge with fearless grace, her silk sweeping, her pen scratching, her laughter echoing through Venetian nights. She was courtesan, muse, poetess, witch, saint, whatever mask her enemies or lovers chose to cast upon her. She wore them all, discarded them at will, and in doing so became unforgettable. Seduction, for her, was not the art of surrender, but the art of power. And in Venice, where masks concealed all, Veronica Franco's mask was the most dangerous of all because behind it there was truth. Venice was a city where desire was never private. Love affairs, however clandestine, became currency in the gossip markets of the Rialto. A senator's tryst could be whispered in taverns by dawn, a courtesan's favour boasted of in gambling dens before the wine had cooled. Veronica Franco lived at the very centre of this carnival of rumour, her every glance interpreted, her every patron measured. To love in Venice was to gamble with reputation, and for a courtesan like Veronica, the stakes were nothing less than survival. Her entanglements with noblemen were both alliances and affections. To take a senator as patron was to secure protection. To accept a merchant enriched by Levantine trade was to secure wealth. Yet Veronica was no mere ornament. She understood that each liaison was a negotiation of power. She gave intimacy, yes, but she also demanded loyalty, gifts, and recognition. Men who entered her chamber left not only with satisfaction, but with obligations that could bind them to her far more tightly than passion alone. But love in Venice was rarely free of politics. A senator's favour made her powerful, but it also made her enemies among rival courtesans who coveted his wealth, and among noble wives who seethed with humiliation. These women, bound by silence in their marriages, wielded influence through whispers. They painted Veronica as corrupter, as witch, as serpent in silk. Each rumour was a dagger aimed at her reputation. Each slander, a stone placed upon the precarious tower of her career. Veronica fought back with the only weapons she trusted: wit and words. In her letters she mocked the jealousy of wives, pointing out the hypocrisy of men who sought her while demanding virtue at home. In her poetry, she turned her rivals into shadows, their beauty ephemeral, their wit non-existent. She knew that in Venice, survival was not won by silence, but by speaking louder, sharper, until one's voice drowned out the rest. Her rivalries with other courtesans were particularly fierce. Beauty was abundant, wit rarer, but reputation was everything. A courtesan who lost her place in a patron's bed might also lose her place in salons, her income, her security. Veronica's rise meant the decline of others, and they hated her for it. Some accused her of arrogance, of scorning traditions, of mocking men too openly. Others spread darker rumours, that she used potions to inflame desire, that she bewitched men with charms hidden beneath her silks. In an age when the Inquisition loomed, such whispers were deadly. And yet, Veronica thrived on rivalry. Each slander forced her to sharpen her defences, each insult another opportunity for satire. She mocked rivals as pretty dolls, their silence mistaken for modesty but born of stupidity. She scorned their dependence on beauty alone, warning that age would strip them bare while her intellect endured. Her confidence was both armour and provocation. Some adored her for it, others plotted her downfall, but none could ignore her. Among her most notable entanglements was with Marco Venier, a patrician and man of letters. His protection offered her prestige, his salon's entry into elite circles. But protection bred dependence, and dependence bred tension. For Veronica was never content to be defined by a man, even one as powerful as Venier. Their liaison was both passion and rivalry, a constant duel of intellect and pride. He celebrated her wit, yet bristled when it outshone his own. She adored his patronage, yet mocked his pomposity. Love, in their case, was a battlefield, fought with verses instead of swords, but leaving scars nonetheless. Beyond lovers and rivals, Veronica also navigated the treacherous waters of politics. Courtesans were often suspected of being informants, their intimacy with powerful men making them dangerous conduits of secrets. Veronica's closeness with senators, ambassadors, and wealthy merchants meant she was always under suspicion. Did she whisper state secrets to rivals? Did she sell confidences to foreign powers? Whether true or not, the perception of such danger clung to her like perfume, intoxicating, irresistible, and perilous. All the while, the Inquisition's shadow darkened. Venice tolerated its courtesans, even celebrated them, but it never forgave them for stepping beyond their role. A courtesan could be muse, she could not be critic. Veronica, by publishing her poetry and letters, by mocking men and defending women, placed herself in danger. Love affairs that once protected her now became vulnerabilities. Patrons who adored her in youth could abandon her in age, leaving her exposed to enemies eager for vengeance. Yet in these years, Veronica burned at her brightest. She was courtesan and poet, muse and adversary, lover and satirist. Men feared her as much as they adored her. Rivals loathed her as much as they envied her. She walked the knife's edge of Venice's hypocrisies, her silks concealing steel, her laughter hiding wounds. For Veronica Franco, love was never simply love. It was power, it was rivalry, it was survival, and it was a fire that could illuminate or consume. The affairs that bound Veronica Franco to Venice's nobility were never mere matters of the heart. Each entanglement was a knot of passion and politics, threads of desire woven with threads of danger. A senator's hand upon her shoulder might feel like affection, but to Veronica it was also a shackle, binding her to his influence while making her a target of his enemies. A merchant's gifts of silk and pearls glittered with devotion, but behind their lustre lay expectation that she would serve his pride as well as his body. Her wit, the very quality that elevated her above other courtesans, was both her greatest asset and her gravest risk. Men adored her sharp tongue when it flattered them, when it teased them into believing they were clever enough to keep pace. But when her laughter turned mocking, when her verses cut too close to truth, admiration curdled into resentment. Many who once praised her brilliance left her chambers with bruised egos, whispering slanders that took root in the fertile soil of Venetian gossip. Jealous wives were perhaps her most dangerous adversaries. The noble women of Venice lived like prisoners in gilded cages, married for politics rather than passion, kept in houses guarded by servants and suspicion. They watched their husbands slip away each evening into masked gondolas and return smelling of perfume not their own. They could not confront their husbands, that was forbidden, unbecoming, a violation of obedience, but they could turn their bitterness toward the women who had supplanted them. Courtesans became the lightning rods of their fury, and none drew more lightning than Veronica Franco. They whispered her name in churches, branding her devil in silk. They described her in poison-tipped detail, her lips painted with witches' salves, her hair scented with charms to ensnare men's souls. Some claimed she bathed in enchanted oils, that her beauty was not natural but conjured. Others insisted she carried amulets, hidden beneath her gowns, filled with powders that inflamed lust and bound hearts. Such rumours spread quickly, for they satisfied the contradiction of Venice. Men could indulge freely, and wives could still cling to the illusion that their husbands were victims, bewitched rather than willing. Veronica did not ignore these attacks. She mocked them in verse, her pen turning slander into spectacle. In one letter, she ridiculed the idea that she wielded potions, writing that if she truly possessed such powers, she would never waste them on men so foolish as to believe such lies. In another, she defended courtesans as necessary to Venice, arguing that they kept men from greater sins, an argument both satirical and deadly serious. Each word was a duel, each poem a parry. She refused to cower, though each defence risked sharpening the blade against her. Rival courtesans were no less relentless. The Courtesans of Venice formed a glittering but vicious hierarchy. Each sought to be the most adorned, the most sought after, the most celebrated. Veronica's rise meant others' decline, and jealousy became venom. Some courtesans spread whispers that she plagiarized her poems, that her verses were ghost-written by men. Others claimed her intellect was arrogance, her wit mere cruelty in disguise. In salons, rivals mocked her openly, daring her to respond, and respond she did, with cutting satire that left the room gasping. Yet every victory in these duels cost her something: a new enemy, a fresh rumour, another watchful eye. Her liaison with Marco Venier was both shield and snare. As a man of letters and a patrician, Venier gave her prestige and entry into Venice's intellectual elite. He celebrated her poetry, defended her reputation in some circles, and provided protection against rivals. Yet their relationship was fraught with tension. Venier admired her wit, but resented being overshadowed by it. He valued her as muse, but recoiled when she asserted herself as equal. Their love was a series of battles disguised as embraces, passion entwined with rivalry. For Veronica, even intimacy was never safe. Through all of this, the Inquisition's shadow lengthened. Priests thundered against the sins of women who ensnare men with their arts, their sermons dripping with venom that clearly pointed toward the courtesans, and toward Franco most of all. Gossip of witchcraft was no longer idle. It was a noose waiting to tighten. Her enemies, jealous wives, rival courtesans, scorned lovers fed these whispers, knowing that in Venice, the line between muse and witch was perilously thin. Yet Veronica endured. More than that, she thrived. She transformed attacks into poems, slanders into satire, rivals into fuel for her pen. She knew that obscurity was death, that scandal was both danger and survival. Better to be hated than forgotten, better to be feared than dismissed. And so she laughed louder, spoke sharper, wrote bolder. She wore her pearls with defiance, published her letters with audacity, and reminded Venice that she was not a shadow but a flame. But flames draw moths and enemies. The higher she rose, the more precarious her perch. She had become more than mistress, more than muse. She had become a voice in a city that demanded women's silence. And in Venice, such defiance could not be tolerated forever. Venice adored performance, but it rarely allowed women a voice beyond the stage of the body. A courtesan might be celebrated for her beauty, for her wit in salons, even for her ability to play the lute or recite Petrarch. But to publish, to write words meant for eternity, was almost unthinkable. Men published, women were muses, ornaments, footnotes. Yet Veronica Franco refused to remain a whisper in the margins. She placed her words in ink, in print, in the hands of strangers, daring the world to hear her voice. Her first great act of audacity came in 1575, when her terza rime were published. This collection of poems, written in the demanding style of Dante, was more than a courtesan's dalliance with verse. It was a declaration. In these poems, Franco spoke of love and betrayal, of passion's cruelty, of men's hypocrisy and women's endurance. She did not write from the pedestal of muse, but from the raw ground of lived experience. Her words pulsed with irony, with vulnerability, with defiance. The poems electrified Venice's literary circles. Some men were scandalized, outraged that a woman, a courtesan, no less dared to enter their sacred realm of letters. Others were enthralled, unable to resist the brilliance of her verse even as it mocked them. Her defenders praised her courage. Her detractors sharpened their pens against her. but none could ignore her. In publishing, Veronica had seized what was denied to nearly all women of her time: immortality through language. In her verses, she exposed the contradictions of Venice. She described men who adored courtesans in private but condemned them in public. She mocked poets who celebrated women as divine while treating them as disposable. She revealed her own vulnerability too: the longing for loyalty, the pain of betrayal, the fragility of a courtesan's life. Yet even in these moments, her voice remained sharp, refusing pity, demanding recognition. Her Lettere Familiari Diversi, a collection of letters published later, deepened her reputation. These were not love notes, but sharp essays disguised as correspondence. To men, she offered biting counsel, mocking their vanity, exposing their infidelity. To women, she offered solidarity, urging them to resist silence, to claim dignity even in a world that denied them power. The letters revealed not only her wit but her philosophy, that women, though constrained, possessed intelligence and worth equal to men, and that courtesans, far from being mere sinners, played a vital role in Venice's society. This was a dangerous philosophy, to suggest that courtesans provided a service not only of pleasure, but of protection, keeping men from worse sins. Easing marriages built on contract rather than affection was to justify the very existence of a class that Venice officially despised. Priests thundered against her writings, declaring them the devil's work. Some nobles snickered, pretending to laugh at her audacity while secretly wounded by her truths. The Inquisition took notice. A courtesan who published was no longer merely scandalous, she was subversive. Yet Franco thrived on the duel of words. When male poets challenged her, she answered with verses that cut deeper than their boasts. One famously mocked her, comparing her to a worn-out coin passed through too many hands. She replied in poetry that turned the insult back upon him, exposing not only his cruelty, but his impotence in wit. The duel became legend, circulated in manuscripts, debated in salons. Her adversary faded into obscurity. Franco's reply still smoulders centuries later. Her words were not only battles but seductions. Patrons who read her poems found themselves drawn more tightly into her orbit, unable to resist a woman who could command with both body and pen. For them, to be immortalized in her verses was as great a prize as her embrace. Others feared her pen, careful never to betray her, lest their names be skewered in rhyme. Her poetry became as much a weapon of survival as her beauty, yet every triumph carried peril. The more she published, the more visible she became, and visibility for a courtesan, there was a double-edged sword. Men who once adored her grew uneasy at the thought of being remembered in ink. Rivals seethed, their envy sharpened by her literary fame. Priests thundered louder, declaring her not muse but witch, and the Inquisition waited, watching the courtesan who dared to write as if she were equal to men. Still, Veronica Franco refused silence. She had known obscurity in her youth, dependence in her failed marriage, precarious survival in her early courtesan years. To have a voice was worth the danger. She continued to write, to publish, to mock, to defend. Her poems and letters survive not because Venice adored her, but because she forced her words into permanence. And in those words she claimed a victory greater than pearls or palaces. She claimed a place in history. Venice thrived on spectacle, and not all spectacles were of flesh or carnival. In the salons of poets, the duel of words was as thrilling as any masquerade, as dangerous as any duel with steel. Reputation could be won or destroyed in a single stanza. A man's wit measured not in swordplay but in rhyme. It was in this arena candlelit, crowded with scholars and senators, that Veronica Franco revealed her most formidable weapon, her pen. Men expected courtesans to flatter, to adorn conversation like jewels upon a gown. They did not expect them to fight. Yet Veronica fought, not with submission but with satire, not with silence but with sharp retorts. Her verses cut deep, exposing hypocrisy, mocking cruelty, laying bare the frailty of male pride. And because she was a courtesan, her blows struck doubly hard. It was not only wit that wounded, but the humiliation of being bested by a woman who sold her body, yet proved her mind sharper than theirs. One of the most infamous duels came when a male poet likened her to a coin, passed through too many hands, its image worn, its value diminished. The insult was cruel, reducing her to abject, tarnished and disposable. But Veronica did not flinch. She replied in verse that turned the metaphor against him. What good was a coin, she asked, if it remained locked away, untouched, unused? A coin gained its worth not in hoarding but in circulation, in the many hands that proved its value. The room erupted, some in laughter, some in outrage. The man was silenced. His insult returned with interest. Franco's reply was copied, passed hand to hand, whispered through Venice like a spark in dry reeds. These duels were more than entertainment. They were survival. In a city where slander could strip a courtesan of her patrons, reputation was as vital as breath. By answering publicly, by winning with wit, Veronica ensured that no insult went unanswered, no rival's mockery left unchallenged. She transformed attack into opportunity, elevating herself as more than courtesan, as combatant, as equal, as poet. Her style was both razor and balm. She could scorn a man so subtly that he left smiling, unaware he had been cut. She could praise with irony so sharp it left its target bleeding with shame. But she could also defend, using her words to uplift women maligned by male poets. In one of her most famous exchanges, she confronted the misogynistic tradition of Italian verse, where women were portrayed as faithless, frivolous, or silent. She defended women's intelligence, their constancy, their dignity. In doing so, she broke centuries of silence, claiming space in a literary world that had never welcomed female voices. The men who sparred with her were both fascinated and unsettled. Some admired her courage, others loathed her audacity, but none could ignore her. In private, they may have dismissed her as courtesan, but in public, they were forced to acknowledge her as poet. She had forced her way into their arena, and once there, she refused to leave. Yet every duel carried risk. To mock a poet was to mock his patrons, his circle, his allies. Enemies multiplied with every stanza she unleashed. Whispers grew that her wit was dangerous, that her pen was venomous. The Inquisition, ever watchful, noted her boldness. A woman who spoke so freely, who shamed men with her words, was perilously close to being branded unnatural, even heretical. Still, Veronica persisted. For her, to remain silent was a greater danger. She knew that beauty would fade, that patrons would falter, that the salons would one day close their doors. But words endured. Each duel she fought, each verse she published, carved her name deeper into memory. Men could sneer, priests could thunder, rivals could slander, but her poems, once printed, were beyond their reach. In these battles of ink, Veronica Franco revealed the truth Venice wished to mask. That women, even courtesans, possessed intellect equal to men, that their silence was not natural but enforced. She spoke not only for herself, but for every woman forced into silence. And though her enemies circled, though danger shadowed her, she left behind victories etched in verse, victories that still echo centuries later. For in Venice, steel could draw blood, but words could kill reputations, and Veronica Franco wielded her words like a sword, each line a slash, each stanza a duel, each poem a triumph wrested from a world that sought her silence. The year was 1580, and Venice trembled under a silence unlike any carnival hush. War, plague, and suspicion had tightened their grip upon the Republic. The Inquisition, always a looming shadow, now moved with deliberate weight through the canals, sniffing out heresy, rooting through whispers. For most citizens, the fear was distant, a sermon, a confession, a rumour of a neighbour imprisoned. But for Veronica Franco, the fear became flesh. She had published. She had spoken too loudly, too boldly, too defiantly. Her terse rhyme and her lettera familiare had not only exposed her wit, but also her audacity, defending women, mocking men, daring to argue that courtesans were not sins in silk but necessary, fixtures of Venetian society. Such words could not go unanswered forever. And so, when plague swept Venice, when the city searched for culprits to blame for divine wrath, her name rose from the murmur of the streets into the ears of inquisitors. The charge was not simply immorality that Venice tolerated, even celebrated. The charge was witchcraft. For what else could explain a courtesan's power to ensnare senators, to humble poets, to enthrall ambassadors? What else but sorcery could explain her eloquence, her defiance, her refusal to be silent? Whispered testimonies claimed she bathed in enchanted oils, carried charms beneath her gowns, recited invocations disguised as poems. A courtesan who was also a poet was unthinkable, unnatural and therefore dangerous. She was summoned. The very word was a sentence in itself. The summons of the Holy Office arrived like a shroud parchment sealed with authority, delivered with cold finality. Veronica Franco, courtesan and poetess, was ordered to appear before the tribunal. The city that had adored her salons now watched her in silence as she stepped into a gondola, bound not for a palace but for the chamber of inquisitors. The room where she stood trial was stripped of ornament. No music, no laughter, no jewels, only shadows and stern faces. The inquisitors sat like statues, their robes heavy, their eyes unblinking. They questioned her not about her poetry, but about her power. Did she use charms to inflame desire? Did she consort with demons? Did she ensnare men's souls with her body and her words? Each question dripped with accusation. Each pause demanded confession. But Veronica Franco did not tremble. She had faced poets who mocked her, rivals who slandered her, lovers who betrayed her. Now she faced inquisitors, and she met them as she had met all others, with wit, with composure, with defiance hidden beneath courtesy. She denied sorcery, denied charms, denied witchcraft. Yes, she was a courtesan. Yes, she was a poet. But no, she was not a witch. Her weapons were words, not potions. Her power was intellect, not sorcery. Perhaps it was her eloquence that saved her. Perhaps it was the lingering influence of her patrons, unwilling to see their names entangled in scandal. Perhaps it was fortune. Whatever the reason, Veronica Franco escaped the flames. She was acquitted, officially free, though never unscarred. For an accusation, even without conviction, left its mark. From that moment forward she carried not only the title of courtesan, not only the scandal of poet, but the stain of suspicion. The trial changed her. Venice no longer seemed the same glittering stage it once had been. Her salons, once filled with music and laughter, grew quieter. Patrons withdrew, fearful of being entangled in her notoriety. Rivals rejoiced, spreading rumours that though acquitted, she had been guilty in truth. The city itself seemed to shift, less indulgent, more cautious. Carnival masks still hid faces, but the eyes behind them watched more carefully. Yet even in the shadow of the Inquisition, Veronica refused to vanish. She continued to write, though less frequently. She continued to appear in salons, though with fewer admirers. She had faced the greatest peril a woman of her time could endure, the accusation of witchcraft, and survived. But survival carried a price. Her glory was dimmed, her power diminished, her path narrowed. The shadow of the Inquisition never fully lifted. It clung to her name, followed her steps, whispered behind her back, and though she had been spared the stake, the trial marked the beginning of her decline. For Venice, once enthralled, now turned its gaze elsewhere, leaving her to wander through the ruins of her own fame. Still, her words remained, and in them, the defiance that had carried her through the trial still burned. She had faced inquisitors and lived to write again. That, in itself, was a victory, though one paid for in whispers, in loneliness, in shadows that never truly left. The decline of a courtesan was always whispered long before it became truth. In Venice, beauty faded quickly, and wit, however sharp, could not polish the tarnish of age. Veronica Franco had survived scandals, rivalries, even the Inquisition itself, but survival was not triumph. The same city that once lifted her in applause now grew restless, impatient, eager to discard yesterday's muse for tomorrow's novelty. Her salons, once crowded with senators, poets and merchants, grew quieter. Patrons who had once vied for her company drifted away, drawn to younger faces, fresher laughter, silks that had not yet grown threadbare. Some excused themselves politely, offering small tokens before departing forever. Others abandoned her coldly, leaving debts unpaid, gifts unreturned, promises broken. The courtesan's golden world was built on sand, and now the tide receded. The aftermath of her trial before the Inquisition had poisoned her reputation. Though acquitted, she carried the mark of suspicion. Whispers lingered. Witch, sorceress, corrupter of men. Noble wives felt vindicated, priests triumphant. Rivals rejoiced at her fall, spreading tales of her disgrace with eager malice. Even those who still admired her hesitated, for to be associated with Veronica Franco was no longer glamorous but dangerous. Her wealth dwindled. Pearls pawned for coins, silks sold piece by piece. The jewels once draped proudly across her neck, vanishing into the hands of pawnbrokers. The palaces where she once dined closed their doors. She returned to more modest lodgings, far from the glittering heart of Venice, her chambers stripped of the music and laughter that had once made them famous. And yet, even in decline, she remained defiant. She continued to write, though her words grew heavier, tinged with sorrow. Letters reveal her bitterness, her frustration at betrayal, her awareness of the hypocrisy that exalted her in youth and condemned her in age. She mourned the loss of patrons but also mocked their cowardice, recognizing that their withdrawal revealed more about them than about her. Her fall was not sudden but a slow unraveling. One by one, the strands of her life snapped: fortune, reputation, and protection. The republic that had once tolerated its courtesans grew less indulgent, more moralistic. Venice itself was changing, its empire fraying at the edges, its people turning inward, less willing to celebrate scandal when war and plague loomed. In this new mood, Veronica Franco no longer fit. Poverty pressed upon her. Once mistress of senators, she now struggled to feed herself, to clothe herself. Some accounts suggest she turned to friends for charity, others that she lived off the remnants of her earlier wealth, eking out a fragile existence. Whatever the truth, the courtesan who had once commanded admiration now faced the daily humiliations of survival. Her enemies did not let her fade in peace. They continued to slander her, mocking her fall, reveling in her ruin. "See," they whispered, "the witch undone, the poet silenced, the courtesan discarded." Their cruelty was the final act of a society that consumed women's beauty and wit, only to spit them out when they had served their purpose. And yet, even in her fall, there was dignity. Veronica Franco did not vanish quietly. Her words endured. She defended women, scorned hypocrisy, mocked betrayal. Her poetry, though written in a world that had turned against her, still burned with the fire of her earlier triumphs. She had lost wealth, reputation, and power, but she refused to lose her voice. In this lies the tragedy of her fall. For Veronica Franco, ruin was not only personal but emblematic. She embodied Venice's double standard celebrated in youth, condemned in age, exalted for wit, despised for independence. Her decline revealed not her failure but her city's hypocrisy, its hunger for scandal followed by its thirst for punishment. By the end of the 1,580 seconds, she lived not as muse or mistress, but as outcast, surviving in the shadows of the republic she once dazzled. Venice forgot her salons, her laughter, her pearls, but her words sharp, mocking, defiant remained. The courtesan had fallen, the poetess remained. The fall of a courtesan was usually final. In Venice, once a woman's beauty dulled and her patrons withdrew, she sank quickly into poverty, obscurity, even into the alleys where common prostitutes hawked themselves for a coin. Few returned from such ruin, yet Veronica Franco, though diminished, did not vanish. She lingered, not in splendour but in shadows, surviving with dignity carved from defiance. Her lodgings, once glittering salons alive with music and wit, shrank to modest chambers. The heavy velvet drapes were gone, replaced by plain cloth. The pearl necklaces had been pawned, the jewelled rings sold. Where once men crowded her door, now silence lingered. Yet on her desk, beneath the flickering glow of a single candle, her pen still scratched. It was writing that saved her, if not in fortune then in spirit. Letters carried her voice when her beauty no longer could. She corresponded with patrons who had abandoned her, some out of desperation, others out of habit. To those who still listened, she appealed for aid, couching her requests in wit so sharp they read like satire rather than supplication. To women, she offered counsel, urging them to endure, to resist silence, to recognize their worth even in a world that denied it. In these later letters her tone shifted less playful, more weary, but never broken. There were still moments of patronage, faint echoes of her past glory. Some admirers, reluctant to see her fall entirely, offered her protection in small measures, coins, gifts, the occasional invitation. These were crumbs compared to the feasts of her youth, but Veronica accepted them with grace, masking humiliation behind laughter. For a courtesan even, charity required performance. Her enemies, however, did not relent. Rivals mocked her decline, noble wives rejoiced at her obscurity, priests thundered that her ruin was divine justice. Yet Franco endured their cruelty with a bitter wisdom. She had seen the cycle too many times. Courtesans adored, courtesans condemned, courtesans forgotten. She knew she was not unique in her fall, only in her refusal to let silence be her epitaph. The Venice she inhabited in these years was darker, more fearful. Plague swept through the city, emptying palaces and filling graves. War drained its coffers, suspicion poisoned its air. The Republic, once jubilant in vice, grew sombre, moralistic, less willing to indulge the glittering world of the courtesan. Franco's decline mirrored the city's own, from exuberance to austerity, from brilliance to shadow. Yet even in obscurity, her reputation lingered. Travellers still whispered her name, recalling the poet courtesan who once defied men with verse. Her books, though not widely read, survived in libraries and collections, her voice preserved even as her body aged and her beauty dimmed. Unlike most courtesans, she had left a record, and that record gave her a strange kind of endurance. In these years, Veronica Franco lived not as a queen of salons but as a ghost of her own fame. She walked through Venice's streets unaccompanied, no longer drawing stares of desire but whispers of pity or scorn. She attended church, perhaps sincerely, perhaps as armour against further suspicion. Some accounts suggest she devoted herself to charity, aiding women and children cast aside as she had been. Whether true or embellished, the image is haunting. The once splendid courtesan now tending the poor, her silks replaced by modest cloth, her jewels by rosary beads. But even here, in shadow, there was dignity. Veronica Franco did not vanish into silence. She continued to write, continued to defend women, continued to assert her worth even as the world turned away. She survived not by reclaiming her throne but by refusing to surrender her voice. Her life in the shadows was not triumph, but it was resistance. And resistance, for a woman in 16th century Venice, was itself a kind of victory. Venice loved its courtesans. Venice despised its courtesans. Both truths lived side by side, braided into the city's soul like the twisted ropes of its gondolas. To understand Veronica Franco is to understand this contradiction that she rose because of it, thrived in spite of it, and fell beneath it. The Republic was built on masks, and none were more revealing than those worn in the presence of courtesans. Men exalted them in verse, painted them in oils, gifted them jewels, built salons around their laughter. Yet in the Senate, those same men voted for laws that stripped courtesans of rights, forbade them from wearing pearls, banished them from certain streets. They were necessary and dangerous, celebrated and condemned. Venice could not live without them, yet it demanded their ruin as proof of its virtue. For noblemen, courtesans were escape from the contracts of marriage. Patrician brides were chosen for dowries, bloodlines, alliances. They were young, silent, cloistered, expected to obey. Courtesans were their opposite, educated, witty, bold. In their company men felt not only pleasure but freedom. And yet, once satisfied, those same men returned to their silent wives and cursed the very women who gave them joy. The church thundered endlessly against the courtesans. From pulpits, priests condemned them as whores, as demons, as witches. They warned men that to lie with such women was to damn one's soul. Yet priests themselves were not absent from brothels, not absent from masked revels. Confessionals filled with murmured admissions and indulgences cleansed the slate for another night. Hypocrisy was not hidden, it was ritualized. Venice turned sin into cycle, indulgence into confession, confession into indulgence again. The law treated courtesans with the same duplicity. Registers of prostitution were kept meticulously, as though documentation itself could contain desire. Courtesans were forbidden from wearing certain colours, yet they paraded through the Piazza San Marco, draped in silks brighter than any noblewoman's. Fines were levied, arrests threatened, but enforcement was lax, selective, often corrupted by bribes or blinded by patrons' protection. The Republic pretended to restrain them while secretly depending on them, and in this contradiction lived Veronica Franco. She was adored for her wit, invited into the salons of patricians, praised for her beauty. Yet the moment scandal touched her, the city turned. When plague swept Venice, she was accused of witchcraft, as though her charms had summoned pestilence. When her patrons withdrew, rivals rejoiced, priests crowed, and senators looked away. She embodied the city's paradox: necessary when adorned, despised when fallen. The double standard was cruelest in age. Men grew old and dignified, their indulgences forgiven as youthful folly. Women, especially courtesans, grew old and discarded, their beauty judged as fraud once it faded, their wit silenced as arrogance. Franco had once mocked men for their hypocrisy, yet in the end she was subject to it, left to struggle in poverty while her male contemporaries aged into respectability. Even in memory, the hypocrisy endured. After her death, her poems survived, studied quietly, whispered about. Yet for centuries she was remembered less as poet than as courtesan, her intellect overshadowed by scandal. Historians dismissed her. Moralists condemned her, while men far less talented retained honour simply because they had never sold their bodies. The irony was bitter. She who had defended women's dignity in verse was denied dignity in remembrance. Venice itself mirrored her fate. The republic that had once ruled the seas, dazzling Europe with wealth and splendour, began its slow decline. Its contradictions hollowed it, just as they had hollowed Franco's life. It lived by indulgence and condemned indulgence, thrived on desire and punished desire, celebrated courtesans and destroyed them. By the 17th century, Venice would be remembered as much for its decadence as for its empire, and Veronica Franco, the courtesan poet, would be remembered if at all as both muse and ruin. Her story, framed against the city's double standards, reveals a truth Venice itself tried to mask, that its grandeur was built on hypocrisy, its serenity on sin, its beauty on betrayal. Veronica Franco was not anomaly, but mirror, reflecting the contradictions of the most serene republic in every verse she wrote, every pearl she wore, every scandal that bore her name. And the mirror, once cracked, never healed. By the 1590 Venice no longer whispered Veronica Franco's name with awe or scandal. The woman who had once been courted by senators, painted as Venus, and published as poetess, was now a shadow wandering through the city she had once ruled with wit and beauty. Her pearls were gone, her gowns reduced to plain cloth, her salons silent. The republic that had once tolerated her audacity had moved on, and the courtesan poet, once immortal in salons, was mortal at last. The exact details of her final years blur, like lanterns dimmed in fog. Some accounts speak of her living in modest quarters, aided by friends or by small patronage from those who pitied her. Others suggest she gave herself to charity, tending the poor and the sick, her once silken hands roughened by labour. Perhaps both are true. The courtesan who had once laughed at senators now whispered prayers in church pews, her wit subdued by necessity, her beauty faded by age. Yet she was not entirely silent. Letters from her later years reveal a voice still sharp, still proud, though tinged with bitterness. She lamented the betrayals of men who had once sworn eternal devotion, mocked their cowardice in abandoning her. She defended her past with fierce dignity, refusing to repent for the life she had lived. If she sought forgiveness, it was not for her profession, but for the cruelty of those who used and discarded women like her. Her health declined. Poverty, stress, and years of struggle took their toll. She died in 1591, at the age of 45, not young but far from old, her life cut short in obscurity. No great procession accompanied her body, no grand tomb was built in her honour. She was buried modestly, her resting place marked not with marble effigies but with silence. The courtesan poet who had once been at the centre of Venice's glittering world left the stage quietly, as though the city itself wished to erase her, and for centuries it succeeded. Veronica Franco was remembered not as poet but as courtesan, her works neglected, her life reduced to scandal. Moralists held her up as a cautionary tale, the dangers of female pride, the ruin awaiting women who defied their place. Historians ignored her, her poetry gathering dust in forgotten volumes. In Venice, her name became a footnote, an anecdote, a ghost, but silence cannot erase ink. Her terza rime and lettere familiari remained, sleeping in libraries, waiting for eyes willing to read beyond scandal. When later generations uncovered them, they found not a simple courtesan's dalliance with verse, but a fierce voice, mocking, witty, defiant, vulnerable. In her words, they found not only the scandal of her life, but the truth of her world, the hypocrisy of men, the double standards of Venice, the endurance of women who refused silence. Her death, quiet as it was, did not end her story. In obscurity, she became something larger, a symbol. To some, she was proof of the wages of sin, a woman punished by poverty and death for her audacity. To others, rediscovering her centuries later, she was a pioneer, a feminist before her time, a woman who claimed her voice in a world that sought to deny it. The aftermath of her life lingers in contradiction. She was muse and mistress, witch and poetess, sinner and saint. Venice condemned her even as it could not forget her, buried her even as it preserved her words. Today, she stands as both cautionary tale and icon, her death of the end of a body, but not of a voice. In 1591, the canals carried her funeral gondola quietly, without pageantry. No bells rang, no salons wept. But perhaps, in the stillness of that night, the city itself felt a tremor, the loss of a voice that had once cut through its hypocrisies like a blade through silk. The courtesan was gone. The poetess remained, and in that endurance lies her true aftermath. For though Venice sought to forget her, history remembered. And Veronica Franco, long after her death, continued to whisper through her verses, mocking silence, defying erasure, her voice rising from the shadows to haunt the city of masks. Venice is a city of ghosts. They drift along the canals at dusk, whispering through the arches of ruined palazzi, their faces glimpsed in rippling water. Among them moves the shadow of Veronica Franco, the courtesan poet whose voice once unsettled senators and priests, whose laughter once filled salons, whose words still burn on brittle pages. She died in obscurity, but obscurity could not contain her. History, like Venice, thrives on masks, and Veronica Franco became a mask of her own symbol, myth, warning, inspiration. What is her legacy? It depends upon the eyes that look at her. To moralists of her own century, she was caution itself, proof that female pride leads to ruin, that courtesans, however witty, are discarded like withered flowers. To later historians, rediscovering her after centuries of silence, she became something else entirely. A pioneer, a woman who seized the pen in a world that demanded her silence, who wrote herself into immortality while other courtesans vanished nameless into the canals of time. Her poetry, he reveals, both faces vulnerability and defiance, longing and mockery and survival and resistance. She wrote of passion, of betrayal, of the hypocrisy of men who exalted women in verse and degraded them in life. She wrote of the precariousness of beauty, the fragility of fortune, the cruelty of gossip. And she wrote of women's dignity, their right to intelligence, to speech, to recognition. In her terza rime, she claimed equality through wit. In her lettere familiari, she defended her profession as necessary, even noble in its honesty. Her words remain startling not only for their elegance, but for their audacity, the refusal to accept silence as destiny. Venice itself shaped her legacy, both preserving and distorting it. The city that condemned her also ensured her survival. Without its paradoxes, its celebration of courtesans in art, and its persecution of them in law, Franco's voice might have remained unremarkable. Instead, she was sharpened by contradiction, forced to fight, compelled to write. Venice devoured her life but preserved her words. In this lies the cruel irony of her legacy. The city that destroyed her body immortalized her voice. In the centuries after her death, she lingered only as scandal. Her name appeared in whispers, her poems forgotten, her reputation reduced to that of a courtesan who dared too much. It was not until later scholars unearthed her writings that the full scope of her life re-emerged. They found not a passive ornament but an active combatant, not a victim but a voice. Feminist historians claimed her as a foremother, a woman who defied the cage of her century. Artists and writers resurrected her, fascinated by her dual identity, sinner and poetess, muse and satirist, victim and rebel. And still, myth surrounds her. Some imagine her as martyr, undone by the cruelty of men and church, others as manipulator, who wielded beauty and wit for power and paid the price. The truth, as always, lies between. Veronica Franco was neither saint nor villain. She was woman intelligent, ambitious, flawed, vulnerable, who lived in a city that demanded masks and punished those who tried to remove them. Her story remains relevant because its paradox endures. Society still exalts beauty while punishing women for wielding it. It still consumes voices that defy silence and casts out those who refuse obedience. Veronica Franco, centuries dead, remains mirror, reflecting both the cruelty of her time and the resilience of those who resist. Walk the canals of Venice at dawn, and her presence lingers. The water glows with the same golden light she once saw. The palaces still stand, their windows shuttered against memory. The Piazza San Marco still fills with masks during Carnival, just as it did when she reigned in salons. And somewhere, in the flicker of a lantern upon the water, one might almost glimpse her dark eyes, sharp smile, a pen in hand, daring the world to forget her again. They will not, for though her pearls have vanished, though her body lies in dust, her words endure. They are her true jewels, her lasting armour, her eternal defiance. Veronica Franco, the courtesan poet, remains, not as victim, not as caution, not as scandal alone, but as voice sharp, haunting, unforgettable. The curtain falls, the lanterns dim, the city of masks resumes its silence, but the ghost of Veronica Franco still speaks, her laughter echoing against the marble walls, her verses whispering in the night air. History rarely allows women the dignity of complexity. They are flattened into saints or sinners, witches or angels, muses or monsters. Veronica Franco was all and none of these, yet for centuries she was remembered only as one, the courtesan. Her poetry gathered dust while her scandal remained alive in whispers. This too was Venice's double standard to exalt her wit in her youth, then reduce her to her body in her death. But her words survived, hidden in libraries, smouldering like embers beneath ash. And in those words, later readers found a different Franco than the scandal-mongers remembered. They found a woman who refused silence, who dared to write herself into history, who mocked the hypocrisy of men and defended the dignity of women. They found vulnerability too, longing for love, bitterness at betrayal, the fragility of a woman forced to trade herself for survival. In her verses, she was neither saint nor whore, but human. That humanity is her true legacy. The myths, however, remain powerful. Some still picture her as enchantress, weaving spells over senators, her pearls dripping like venom. Others imagine her as martyr, dragged to ruin by the cruelty of men and priests. Both images flatter the storytellers more than the woman herself. The enchantress absolves men of their choices, making them victims of her charms. The martyr flatters modern readers, painting her as pure victim rather than agent of her own survival. The truth is harder, more unsettling. Veronica Franco was both complicit in her world and defiant of it, both participant and critic, both survivor and casualty. Venice itself could never fully bury her. The city that destroyed her also preserved her, because Venice is addicted to contradiction. Its artists painted courtesans as Venuses, long after condemning them in law. Its writers mocked them in satire while immortalizing them in verse. Franco's name lingered in the city's bloodstream, half poison, half perfume. Even forgotten, she was never gone. Her rediscovery centuries later changed her legacy once again. Scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries stumbled upon her works and were startled to find a female voice echoing from the Renaissance. Feminists of the 20th century claimed her as a forerunner, a woman who dared to challenge patriarchy in an age that silenced women. Writers and filmmakers reimagined her, fascinated by her dual identity, courtesan and poetess, seductress and intellectual, sinner and rebel. She became symbol again, but this time of defiance rather than scandal. Yet even here, myth threatens truth. To call her feminist is both apt and anachronistic. She did not fight for all women. She fought for herself, and in doing so illuminated truths that resonate still. Her survival strategy, wit, seduction, defiance, was not liberation, but endurance. And yet, endurance itself was revolutionary in a world where women's silence was enforced with law and fire. Veronica Franco's legacy, then, is not purity, but complexity. She is a reminder that women's voices, however fragile, can pierce centuries of silence. She is proof that ink can outlast pearls, that words can endure where beauty fades. She is warning, too, that society consumes women who defy it, punishes them when they grow inconvenient, forgets them until rediscovery makes them useful again. And Venice? Venice is still her mirror. The city remains a place of masks, of contradictions, of beauty entwined with decay. Tourists drift through canals, unaware that their gondolas glide over waters that once carried Franco to inquisitorial chambers. Lovers kiss in shadowed alleys where courtesans once bargained survival. The Piazza San Marco still fills with masks during Carnival, repeating rituals of concealment and revelation that Franco herself mastered. In every mask, in every whisper, she lingers. At dawn, when the fog curls low over the lagoon, one might imagine her walking still no longer in pearls, no longer in velvet, but in memory. Her dark eyes gleam, her lips curve into a smile both mocking and tender. Her hand clutches a quill that drips not ink but shadow. She is courtesan, she is poetess, she is ghost. Venice cannot escape her, because Venice created her. And so her legacy is not silence but haunting. She haunts the history of women silenced and erased. She haunts the hypocrisy of men who praised and condemned in the same breath. She haunts Venice itself, eternal city of masks, where truth is always hidden beneath performance. The curtain falls, but the echo remains. Veronica Franco still speaks, not only through her surviving poems, but through the contradictions she embodied. Her life was a tragedy, yes, but also a defiance. She reminds us that voices can be buried, but not forever. She reminds us that women, however condemned, will always find ways to speak. And as the gondolas glide across the dark canals, as lanterns shimmer upon the water, as masks conceal and reveal in the same moment, her laughter rises faintly in the mist, mocking, defiant, unforgettable. The courtesan is gone. The poetess endures. The ghost of Veronica Franco still dances in Venice. Legends are born not from perfection but from fractures. Veronica Franco's life was all fracture, brilliance cut by ruin, survival cut by betrayal, fame cut by poverty. Yet it is precisely this jaggedness that makes her endure. For history has little use for the flawless. It remembers those who reveal its contradictions. And Franco revealed Venice's most intimate paradox. The city exalted courtesans while damning them, consumed women's wit while punishing them for wielding it, immortalized desire while destroying the desiring woman. Her legacy is entwined with Venice's own decline. As the 17th century dawned, the Republic began to fade. Trade routes shifted to the Atlantic, draining its wealth. Wars with the Ottoman Empire sapped its strength. Plague returned again and again, hollowing its population. The shimmering city of masks grew brittle, its grandeur laced with decay. The courtesans, once essential to its myth, dwindled in influence. By the time Venice became a tourist spectacle centuries later, its courtesans were remembered only in whispers, painted faces fading into shadow. Yet, Franco's voice returned, rediscovered, reprinted, reinterpreted. She was no longer simply courtesan but symbol. Feminist scholars saw in her not just a woman of scandal, but a woman who demanded speech in an age that demanded silence. Writers and filmmakers resurrected her as heroine, muse, rebel. She became what Venice had denied her in life, inspiration. But even this resurrection is a kind of mask. Each age reshapes her, fitting her into its desires, temptress for the moralists, victim for the romantics, pioneer for the feminists. Her true self, complex and contradictory, lies always behind a mask of interpretation. In this, she is Venice itself, glittering facade over hidden depths, myth wrapped around reality. Just as the city cannot be understood without acknowledging both its beauty and its rot, Franco cannot be understood without acknowledging both her complicity and her defiance. She was not saintly rebel nor scheming witch, but a woman who played the only roles available to her and wrote herself into permanence despite them. Her ghost belongs not only to Venice, but to the wider history of women who dared to speak. She stands beside figures like Gaspara Stampa, silenced by heartbreak, like Tulia d'Aragona, who philosophized about love but was dismissed as harlot, like countless nameless women whose wit was lost because they had no means to preserve it. Franco is remembered not because she was unique, but because she left words behind, fragile lifelines, thrown across centuries, saving her from the oblivion that claimed her sisters. And so she becomes symbol for all who have been silenced, erased, diminished. Her survival in ink is testament that words can outlast scorn, that defiance can echo even in ruin. But her haunting is not soft, not gentle. Read her verses today, and her laughter still stings, her irony still burns. She is not easy icon. She mocks even as she inspires, reminding us that her life was not liberation but endurance, not triumph but struggle. To romanticize her is to betray her. Her ghost demands honesty, that her life was brilliant and bitter, that her words were weapons forged in desperation as much as in pride. Venice cannot escape her. Walk the city at night, and she lingers. The gondolas slide through black waters, their prows cutting the surface like knives. The lanterns shimmer, reflections breaking like memory. In the Piazza San Marco, masks still gleam in carnival light, repeating the rituals she once knew. And somewhere in the labyrinth of alleys, in the hush of fog, her footsteps echo not the soft tread of courtesan in velvet, but the deliberate stride of poetess with pen in hand. She does not ask to be pitied. She does not ask to be absolved. She asks to be remembered in her contradictions, in her sharpness, in her humanity. She asks us to confront the hypocrisy that made her both goddess and witch, muse and whore, poet and scandal. She asks us to see her not as mask but as woman, and when the bells of San Marco toll midnight, when the fog rises thick upon the canals, her ghost is said to drift still dark, eyes gleaming, lips curved in ironic smile, a quill dripping shadows in her hand. She does not vanish, for history cannot silence her. She lingers, whispering through the city of masks. I am not gone. I am not silent. I am not erased. The curtain falls, the lanterns dim, the canals sigh. Venice remains. Veronica Franco remains. The courtesan is dust. The poetess endures. The ghost walks, and history listens.